What they did to nuns accused of breaking their vows would shock you before the sun rose each morning. The convent was already awake. Long stone corridors echoed with soft footsteps as the nuns moved quietly from their small rooms toward the chapel. The building itself was old, built decades earlier, and it carried a heavy silence that never truly left. Thick walls blocked out most sounds from the outside world, making time feel slower inside. For the women who lived there, this place was not just a home, it was the whole world they knew. Most of the nuns had entered the convent when they were very young. Some were barely out of their teenage years. Many came from poor families who believed this life would bring honor, safety, and spiritual meaning. Others were sent because their families felt it was the best or only option. Once inside, their former lives slowly faded. Their names were replaced with new ones. Their clothes became identical. Personal belongings were given up and letters from home were rare and closely watched. Daily life followed strict routines. Every hour had a purpose, and every action had rules. Prayer filled much of the day, beginning early in the morning and ending late at night. Between prayers, the nuns worked. Some cleaned the floors and halls, others cooked meals, washed clothes, or tended small gardens. The work was hard and repetitive, but they were taught that suffering was a path to devotion. Complaints were discouraged, and questions were seen as weakness. Silence was one of the most powerful rules. In many convents, speaking without permission was not allowed outside prayer or work instructions. Meals were often eaten in silence, with only the sound of utensils touching plates. During this time, one nun might read religious texts aloud, reminding everyone of obedience and sacrifice. The message was always clear. True faith meant giving up the self completely. The leaders of the convent held absolute authority. They decided who worked where, who was allowed rest, and who needed correction. Their decisions were rarely explained. To doubt them was to doubt the institution itself. Young nuns learned quickly that obedience mattered more than intention. Even small mistakes, like being late to prayer or dropping something during work, could bring attention they did not want. Fear lived quietly alongside faith. No one spoke about it openly, but everyone felt it. The idea of being singled out was terrifying. A look from a superior, a call to step aside, or a sudden change in duties could mean something was wrong. Rumors traveled silently, passed through looks rather than words. When one nun disappeared from daily routines, others noticed, but no one asked questions. The convent presented itself as a place of peace and holiness to the outside world. Visitors saw neat halls, calm faces, and polite smiles. They were told stories of devotion and service, but visitors never stayed long, and they never saw the hidden parts of daily life. What happened inside remained inside. This secrecy was protected by tradition and respect, making it almost impossible for outsiders to imagine anything troubling behind the walls. For many nuns, the hardest part was loneliness. Even though they lived among many others, personal connections were limited. Friendships existed, but they were quiet and cautious. Trust was risky, because anything shared could be misunderstood or reported. Emotional needs were often ignored, labeled as selfish or unspiritual. Over time, some women felt their emotions dull, as if they were slowly disappearing. Training emphasized purity and discipline, but the meaning of these ideas was often unclear. Rules were taught without explanation, and fear of doing something wrong grew stronger than understanding what was right. A misplaced glance, a misunderstood comment, or even an imagined fault could become a problem. The pressure to be perfect was constant, and perfection was impossible. Some nuns struggled internally. They questioned whether they truly belonged there, but leaving was not simple. Once vows were taken, leaving was seen as failure and shame. Families were often discouraged from welcoming former nuns back. This knowledge trapped many women in silence. Even when doubts grew, they pushed them aside, believing endurance was their duty. Over time, a system of watching developed. Senior nuns were expected to observe the younger ones. Reports were made, sometimes based on personal dislike or misunderstanding. There was no clear way to defend oneself. An accusation, even a small one, could follow a nun for years. The fear of being noticed for the wrong reason shaped every movement and thought. Despite this, many nuns truly believed in their purpose. They prayed sincerely and tried to find comfort in faith. Some found moments of peace during quiet prayer or while working alone. These small moments kept them going, but even faith could not erase the tension that filled the air. Everyone knew that one mistake, or even the appearance of one, could change everything. The convent's strict order was praised as discipline, but it left little room for humanity. Individual stories were swallowed by routine. Pain was hidden behind calm faces. The idea that this life was chosen freely did not match the reality many lived. Choices had been made for them long before they understood the cost. As days turned into years, the walls seemed to close in. Time blurred, marked only by bells calling them to the next task. Some nuns grew older quietly, their lives passing unnoticed. Others carried invisible wounds from years of pressure and silence. Still, the system continued, unchanged and unquestioned. This was the world where accusations would later arise, a place where obedience outweighed truth, where silence protected authority, and where fear made defense nearly impossible. Long before any punishment or judgment, the foundation was already set. Inside those walls, life was controlled, voices were muted, and the cost of being misunderstood was far greater than anyone outside could imagine. At first, the accusations did not come loudly. They arrived quietly, like a cold wind slipping through a crack in the wall. A look held too long, a whisper overheard, a routine broken by a single mistake. In the convent, nothing unusual ever needed proof. The feeling that something was not right was often enough. It usually began with a small change. A nun might be asked to stay behind after prayer. Another might be moved from her usual work without explanation. Sometimes a superior would begin watching one woman more closely than the others. These moments created tension because everyone understood what they meant. Attention was never given without a reason, and reasons were rarely good. Suspicion grew in silence. No one openly said what was wrong, but the atmosphere shifted. The accused nun often did not know what she had done. She searched her memory again and again, replaying every word spoken, every movement made. Fear crept into her thoughts, making even innocent actions feel dangerous. The mind became its own judge, constantly asking, was that a mistake? In this environment, rumors were powerful. A single comment, misunderstood or repeated incorrectly, could change how someone was seen. Because silence was the rule, rumors did not travel through words but through behavior. Others began to keep their distance. Friendly glances disappeared. Shared work became quiet and uncomfortable. Isolation often began before any accusation was spoken aloud. Many accusations were based on strict interpretations of rules that were never clearly explained. The convent expected complete control over thoughts, behavior, and emotions. If a nun seemed distracted during prayer, it could be seen as a lack of devotion. If she appeared close to another nun, it might be labeled improper attachment. Even sadness could be treated as a sign of spiritual weakness. There was no clear system for fairness. When concerns were raised, the accused was rarely told who made them or why. Meetings with superiors were one-sided. Questions were discouraged, and explanations were often vague. The message was clear. Obedience mattered more than understanding. To ask for clarity was sometimes seen as resistance. Some superiors truly believed they were protecting the institution. They had been trained to see discipline as kindness and correction as love. Over time, this belief hardened. It allowed them to act without doubt, even when their actions caused harm. Once suspicion formed, it was difficult to remove. Doubt was treated as truth. For the nun under suspicion, daily life became unbearable. Every action felt watched. Even breathing felt too loud. She tried harder to be perfect, but the effort only made her more visible. Nervousness was mistaken for guilt. Silence was mistaken for secrecy. Nothing she did seemed right anymore. Other nuns noticed these changes but felt helpless. Speaking up could bring attention to themselves. Defending someone else might be seen as shared guilt. Many believed that if someone was accused, there must be a reason. Trust in the system had been taught for so long that questioning it felt wrong. So most remained quiet, even when something felt unfair. Sometimes accusations were influenced by personal conflict. Not everyone inside the convent was kind or patient. Differences in personality, jealousy, or misunderstanding could play a role. But once framed as a spiritual concern, personal feelings were hidden behind religious language. This made the accusation seem serious and unquestionable. Written reports were often used, but the accused rarely saw them. These reports could include opinions presented as facts. Small behaviors were listed as patterns. Silence was described as withdrawal. Tiredness was described as lack of commitment. Over time, the image created on paper no longer matched the real person, but the paper carried more weight than lived experience. The accused nun was usually encouraged to confess, even if she did not understand what she was supposed to confess to. Confession was presented as the path to peace. Refusing to confess was seen as pride. Many women, exhausted and confused, began to doubt themselves. They wondered if they had failed in ways they could not see. This doubt was deeply damaging. When a person begins to mistrust her own thoughts, she becomes easy to control. Some nuns accepted blame simply to make the pressure stop. Others stayed silent, hoping obedience would restore trust. Neither option truly helped. Once suspicion existed, it rarely disappeared on its own. The process was slow and heavy. Days passed with no answers. Meetings ended without resolution. The waiting itself became a form of punishment. Sleep became difficult. Prayer felt empty. Faith, once a source of comfort, became tangled with fear. The accused nun felt alone even when surrounded by others. Outsiders never saw this stage. To the world beyond the walls, everything appeared calm and holy. Letters sent home were carefully written. Visits, if allowed, were supervised. The language used was always gentle and positive. No one outside was told about investigations or concerns. The institution protected its image at all costs. Inside, however, the emotional weight was crushing. Some nuns grew physically ill. Others became withdrawn and quiet. Their strength slowly faded, not because they lacked faith, but because they were constantly under pressure. There was no safe place to rest or speak freely. The most painful part was not knowing what would happen next. Would the suspicion fade? Would it grow? Would punishment follow? The uncertainty made every moment heavy. Even small joys disappeared. Laughter felt dangerous. Smiling felt wrong. Life became a careful performance meant to avoid further attention. In some cases, suspicion spread to others. Anyone who showed kindness to the accused might also be watched. This created distance and loneliness. Relationships broke apart quietly. The community, meant to be a place of support, became divided by fear. Despite everything, some nuns still believed the system would be fair in the end. They trusted that truth would be seen. This hope kept them going, even as evidence suggested otherwise. Faith in justice was sometimes the last thing left, but the system was not built to protect individuals. It was built to protect order. Once someone was labeled as a problem, the focus shifted to correction rather than understanding. The original question of truth was often forgotten. What mattered was restoring control. As suspicion hardened into accusation, the tone changed. Conversations became shorter. Instructions became sharper, compassion faded. The accused nun was no longer seen as a person struggling, but as a lesson for others. Her experience became a warning, spoken without words. This stage was the point of no return for many. What began as quiet concern now carried weight and consequence. The groundwork had been laid. Judgment was coming, even if it had not yet been named. Behind the calm faces and orderly routines, a decision was forming. The convent continued its daily rhythm, bells ringing and prayers spoken, but something had shifted. Trust had been replaced by fear. Silence had become heavier, and for those under accusation the worst was still ahead. When the decision was finally made, it was rarely announced clearly. There was no formal statement, no open explanation. The change simply happened. The accused nun would be called aside and told that she needed correction or reflection. The words sounded gentle, but everyone understood what they meant. Her life was about to change in ways she could not control. She might be moved to a different part of the convent, away from familiar faces. Sometimes this meant a small, cold room with very little light. Other times it meant long hours of work done alone. The purpose, she was told, was to help her think, repent, and grow stronger in faith. But the loneliness felt heavy, pressing down on her thoughts day and night. Daily routines became harder. While others worked together, she worked apart. While others prayed in groups, she was sometimes kept at the back or asked to pray alone. These separations were never explained openly, but they sent a clear message. She was no longer trusted. She was being watched. Silence, already strict before, became even more intense. She was discouraged from speaking unless spoken to. Questions were not welcomed. If she tried to explain herself, she was told to focus on obedience instead of words. Over time, she learned that speaking only made things worse. Work assignments often changed. Tasks became longer and more physically demanding. She might be asked to clean the same area again and again, even when it was already spotless. Or she might be given work that was difficult for her, without help or guidance. Mistakes were noted carefully, while effort was ignored. Meals became another quiet test. She ate the same food as everyone else, but often at different times or in different places. Sometimes she was last to be served. No one said it was punishment, but she felt the difference. Hunger mixed with humiliation, and both stayed with her long after the meal ended. Correction sessions were especially painful. She was called to sit before superiors who spoke calmly but firmly. They listed her faults, many of which she did not understand. When she tried to respond, she was reminded that true humility meant listening, not defending. Tears were seen as weakness. Silence was seen as acceptance. The emotional weight of these sessions stayed with her. She replayed every word afterward, wondering how she could have answered differently. Slowly, she began to believe the version of herself described to her. Confidence faded. Self-trust disappeared. She started to see herself only through the eyes of authority. Other nuns noticed her absence and her changes. Some felt sympathy but did not show it. A kind word or glance could bring trouble. Fear kept everyone careful. The community became quieter, not because of peace, but because of tension. Everyone learned what happened when someone was judged. Time moved strangely during this period. Days felt endless, but weeks passed quickly. Without meaningful interaction, life blurred together. Bells rang, work was done, prayers were spoken, but nothing felt real. She existed in routine, not living, just enduring. Faith, once a comfort, became complicated. She prayed constantly, asking for understanding, forgiveness, or strength. Sometimes prayer helped. Other times it made her feel more broken. She wondered why devotion did not bring relief. She wondered if she had truly failed, even if she did not know how. Sleep was difficult. The mind never rested. Thoughts circled endlessly, filled with fear of making another mistake. Dreams were restless. Mornings arrived too quickly, bringing another day of watching herself carefully. Even small actions like walking or folding cloth felt heavy with meaning. Some nuns grew physically weaker during this time. Long hours of work and stress took their toll. But illness was often seen as something to push through. Rest was limited. Complaints were discouraged. Strength was praised even when it cost health. The idea behind these measures was control, though it was never named as such. The system believed that strict correction would restore order and purity, but what it often did was break the spirit of the person involved. Quiet obedience replaced joy. Fear replaced faith. There was no clear end to this period. No one said how long it would last or what would make it stop. The accused nun lived in uncertainty, hoping each day might be the last, fearing it would not be. This uncertainty was one of the hardest parts. Without a goal, endurance felt endless. Some women accepted everything without resistance. They believed suffering was their path. Others struggled internally, feeling anger or sadness they were not allowed to express. Both responses were hidden. Outwardly, everyone looked the same: calm, quiet, obedient. Occasionally, a superior would show kindness. A softer tone, a small allowance, a brief word of encouragement. These moments felt powerful, almost overwhelming. They reminded the accused nun of her humanity, but they were rare and unpredictable. She learned not to expect them. The rest of the community learned lessons from watching. They saw what happened when rules were questioned or when someone stood out. They became more careful, more silent, more distant. Individuality faded further. The system strengthened itself through example. Letters from family, if allowed, were often delayed or shortened. Personal connections weakened. Without outside voices, the convent's version of reality became the only one. The accused nun had no mirror except the one held up by authority. As weeks turned into months, some nuns began to lose hope. They stopped imagining a future beyond the present routine. Life became something to survive, not something to live. Their identities shrank to the roles assigned to them. Yet even in this difficult time, small moments mattered. A ray of light through a window, a quiet moment in prayer, the sound of wind in the courtyard. These moments reminded her that the world was larger than her suffering. They did not solve anything, but they offered brief relief. The punishment phase was not loud or dramatic. It was slow, quiet, and constant. That made it more powerful. There were no visible marks, no public scenes. Everything happened behind walls, protected by silence and tradition. By the time this stage ended or shifted into something else, the person who entered it was changed. Confidence was gone. Trust was damaged. The experience left deep marks on the heart and mind, even if no one else could see them. This was how control worked, not through force that could be easily named, but through routine, isolation, and fear. It reshaped people quietly, teaching them to disappear inside themselves. And for many nuns, this was not the end of the story. It was only the middle. What came next would test them even more, pushing them to the edge of endurance. But by then, they were already tired, already worn down, already taught to accept whatever came next in silence. As time passed, the pressure reached its highest point. What had once felt like correction now felt like a test of endurance. The accused nun understood that this stage was different. The attention on her was sharper. The expectations were heavier. Every small action seemed to carry great weight, as if one wrong step could decide everything. She was called more often to private meetings. The tone was calm, but the meaning was serious. She was reminded again and again of obedience, humility, and silence. The words were familiar, yet now they felt final. She sensed that the leaders were no longer observing her to understand, but to conclude. A judgment was forming, even if it had not yet been spoken aloud. Work became more demanding. Tasks were longer and offered no rest. Sometimes she worked from early morning until late evening with only short breaks. The work itself was not new, but the lack of relief made it exhausting. Her body ached, but she was expected to continue without complaint. Strength was praised only when it served the rules. Her isolation deepened. She was rarely placed near others. Even shared prayers felt distant. When she entered a room, conversation stopped, not because others disliked her, but because fear told them to stay away. She became a reminder of what could happen. Her presence made others nervous, and that hurt more than anger would have. Inside, her thoughts battled constantly. One part of her still hoped that patience would bring understanding. Another part felt a growing sadness that could not be named. She wondered if she would ever be seen as she truly was again. She wondered if truth mattered at all in a place built on order rather than listening. During prayer, her mind wandered despite her best efforts. Instead of peace, she felt confusion. She asked for clarity, but answers did not come. Silence met her questions. This silence felt different from before. It no longer felt holy. It felt empty. Some nights she sat awake long after others slept. The convent was quiet and shadows filled the halls. In those moments, she allowed herself to feel emotions she hid during the day. Sadness, fear, and loneliness surfaced quietly. She did not cry loudly. She had learned not to. Everything about her existence had become careful and controlled. The leaders believed this stage was necessary. They believed pressure would reveal truth. But pressure does not always reveal truth. Sometimes it only reveals how much a person can endure. The system did not ask what was fair. It asked what was effective in maintaining control. The accused nun was encouraged once more to admit fault. The request was framed as kindness. Confession was described as freedom, but she still did not know what she was meant to confess. Admitting guilt for something unclear felt wrong, yet refusing felt dangerous. She stood at a silent crossroads with no safe path. Some women before her had chosen to confess simply to end the process. She knew this. She had seen how quickly pressure stopped once someone accepted blame, but she also saw how those women changed afterward. They carried quiet shame. They were never fully trusted again. Confession closed one door but opened another. Others had remained silent and endured everything. Some eventually faded into the background. Some were reassigned to distant places. Some were remembered only as warnings. Their stories were never spoken openly, but their absence spoke clearly. The weight of choice pressed heavily on her. Each day felt like standing on the edge of something unseen. She knew that whatever happened next would shape the rest of her life inside the convent. There would be no return to how things were before. Physically, she was growing weaker. Her hands trembled during work. Her steps slowed. Still, she pushed forward. Stopping was not an option. Rest was limited, and asking for it felt like failure. She learned to ignore discomfort, just as she had learned to ignore her own voice. Despite everything, small signs of humanity still appeared. A passing glance of concern. A quiet gesture of help left unnoticed by others. These moments reminded her that not everyone agreed with what was happening, but fear kept kindness small and hidden. The climax of this period came quietly, without ceremony. One day, she was told that her future would soon be decided. No details were given. No timeline was offered, just those words. They echoed in her mind long after the conversation ended. Waiting became unbearable. Each morning, she woke with a heavy feeling in her chest. Each evening, she went asleep unsure of what the next day would bring. The uncertainty drained her more than the work ever had. Time felt slow and fast at the same time. Other nuns sensed the tension. The convent felt tighter, quieter. Everyone followed rules more carefully. Laughter disappeared completely. The air was thick with caution. It was as if the entire place was holding its breath. During this time, the accused nun reflected deeply on her life. She remembered why she had come here in the first place. She remembered hope, purpose, and belief. Comparing those memories to her present reality was painful. She wondered how something meant to be sacred had become so heavy. She did not see herself as broken or disloyal. She saw herself as human, but the system did not leave room for that word. Human needs were inconvenient. Human emotions were suspicious. Human weakness was something to be corrected, not understood. The final meeting arrived without warning. She was called into a familiar room and asked to sit. The leaders spoke slowly. Their words were careful and measured. They spoke of concern, of discipline, of order. They spoke of the need to protect the community. She listened quietly. Her heart raced, but her face remained calm. She had learned how to hide feelings well. Whatever decision was made, she knew she would not be asked how she felt about it. Her role was to accept. In that moment, she realized something important. The process had never truly been about her actions. It had been about control, appearance, and fear of disorder. Understanding this did not change the outcome, but it changed how she saw herself. She was not the problem. The system was. This realization did not bring comfort, but it brought clarity. She stopped blaming herself for everything. Deep inside, a small part of her remained untouched by judgment. That part held her sense of worth. As she left the room, the future was still unclear, but the turning point had passed. The hardest emotional moment was behind her. Whatever came next would be difficult, but she would face it with the quiet strength she had built through endurance. The climax was not loud. There were no raised voices or dramatic scenes. It was quiet, controlled, and deeply personal. That made it more powerful. A life had been reshaped without noise. For the convent, this was another case, another lesson, another example. For her, it was the moment everything changed. The pressure had reached its peak, and the outcome was now set in motion. And as the bells rang again, calling everyone back to routine, life continued on the surface as if nothing had happened. But beneath that calm rhythm, a truth remained. The cost of silence had been paid, and its impact would last far beyond this moment. The decision, when it finally came, did not arrive with shock. It arrived quietly, almost gently, as if it were just another instruction in a long list of rules. She was told where she would go next, what her new role would be, and how she should accept it. The words were calm and formal. There was no space for reaction, no invitation to speak. Acceptance was expected, not discussion. Her life changed in practical ways immediately. She was moved away from the center of the convent's daily life. Her duties became smaller, less visible. She was no longer asked for opinions or trusted with responsibility. It was clear that she would remain, but only on the edges. She was allowed to exist, but not to belong fully. At first, this felt like another loss. She had already lost so much: trust, confidence, connection. Now she lost purpose as well. The work she did felt empty, repetitive, and disconnected from meaning. Days passed slowly, one after another, with little difference between them. Yet something unexpected happened over time. Without constant pressure and observation, her mind slowly became quieter. The fear that had lived inside her for so long began to loosen its grip. She was still careful, still silent, but the sharp edge of anxiety softened. For the first time in a long while, she could think without panic. She began to reflect on everything she had been through, not in a painful way, but in a distant, thoughtful way. She saw patterns now that she could not see before. She saw how silence had been used to control, how fear had replaced compassion, how order had been valued more than people. Understanding these patterns did not erase the pain, but it helped her place it outside herself. She realized she was not alone. Over time, she noticed other women in similar positions. They did not speak openly, but their eyes told familiar stories. Quiet understanding passed between them. A shared look, a small gesture, a moment of kindness that needed no words. These connections were subtle, but they mattered. As years passed, the world outside the convent began to change. Stories started to surface. Former members, now older and no longer bound by silence, began to speak carefully about their experiences. At first, these stories were ignored or doubted. Tradition is powerful, and many people did not want to believe that harm could exist in places meant to represent goodness. But the stories continued. More voices joined, details matched, patterns repeated. Slowly, the truth became harder to dismiss. The image of perfection began to crack, not all at once, but piece by piece. Inside the convent, change was slow. Institutions like this do not move quickly, but small shifts occurred. Rules were softened. Language changed slightly. Leaders became more careful with their words. These changes were never announced as corrections, but they were signs that something had been heard. For the woman at the center of this story, recognition did not come directly. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what she had endured, but she noticed the difference. Newer members were treated with more patience. Questions were allowed more often. The harshness she had known became less common. This brought mixed feelings. On one hand, she felt relief that others might not suffer as she had. On the other, she felt sadness that change had come too late for her. Her life had already been shaped by years of pressure and silence. Some things could not be returned. Still, she found a quiet kind of peace. She stopped measuring her worth by the system's judgment. She understood that her value had never depended on approval. This realization grew slowly, like light returning after a long night. Her faith, once tangled with fear, began to separate from the institution. She no longer saw belief as obedience alone. She found meaning in compassion, honesty, and understanding. These ideas felt truer to her than rigid rules ever had. She did not speak out publicly. Some people are not meant to be loud voices. Her strength was quieter. She lived with integrity, kindness, and awareness. In doing so, she reclaimed something important herself. Outside the convent, conversations continued. Investigations were made. Histories were reviewed. Some practices were questioned openly for the first time. The world reacted with surprise, then concern, then reflection. People began to understand how easily authority can hide behind respect and how silence can protect harm. These discussions did not erase the past, but they mattered. They honored experiences that had been hidden for too long. They reminded others to question systems that demand obedience without accountability. As time went on, the woman aged. Her hair grayed. Her movements slowed. But inside, she felt lighter than she had in years. She no longer carried constant self-blame. She knew the truth of her own story, and that was enough. Younger members sometimes came to her quietly for guidance. She did not give warnings or tell stories in detail. She simply listened. She treated them with patience and respect. In doing so, she offered what she herself had needed most. The convent still stood, its walls unchanged. But the meaning of those walls had shifted. They no longer represented absolute authority in her mind. They were just stone and silence, no longer powerful enough to define her. Looking back, she understood the full impact of what had happened. It was not just about one person or one accusation. It was about a system that valued image over truth, control over care. Seeing this clearly allowed her to let go of anger. Her story, like many others, became part of a larger understanding. It reminded the world that even places built on good intentions can cause harm when power goes unchecked. It showed how important it is to listen, to question, and to protect human dignity. In the end, there was no dramatic ending, no final confrontation, no public apology. Real life rarely offers such neat conclusions. Instead, there was growth, awareness, and quiet change. The woman lived the rest of her life with dignity. She carried scars, but they no longer defined her. She had survived something that tried to erase her voice, and she had found a way to exist beyond it. Her story did not shock because of violence or spectacle. It shocked because of its quietness, because it showed how harm can happen slowly, politely, and behind closed doors, because it showed how silence can be more powerful than noise. And most of all, it mattered because it reminded others of a simple truth. Faith, devotion, and discipline mean nothing without compassion. Authority must always be questioned, and no system should ever be more important than the people inside it.